We're joined by Gareth Murphy, who is Head of Industrial Relations and Campaigns at the Financial Services Union. Gareth, thank you very much for joining us. What do you mean by union busting?
So what we mean by union busting is any behaviours by employers that are basically designed to avoid a trade union, resist their workers organising a union, or in the worst examples or cases, actually penalise and victimise staff workers who join a trade union at work. So it's those negative, hostile behaviours from employers towards trade union members and activists.
Are companies entitled to not deal with a union in the workplace, to say that even if employees are members, to say that they won't deal with the union representatives?
Sadly, today they absolutely are in Ireland. They can avoid a trade union, and there's no law that legally mandates them to engage with the trade union. And I would say that's outrageous in the 21st century in a modern democracy, when actually that right is recognised as a human right in many, many international conventions and declarations of human rights, the freedom of association, the freedom to organise, etc. But sadly, that is the case today.
And can they prevent any employee being a member of a union?
Well, they do prevent employees being a member.
Legally, is that allowed? Can they make it a condition of employment to say you can't be part of a union, or do they have to be more subtle about it?
So they are much more subtle about it. But actually, I have seen contracts of employment that specify that employment is not collectively bargaining, won't collectively bargaining, and won't recognise with a union. What I'd say is that clause in a contract is probably not legally enforceable, but that doesn't matter. That sends a message to the staff member that by signing this contract, you're not to join a union. So even if these things are not really allowed, they happen, and they send a message to that individual, but also to staff generally, that you shouldn't join unions.
Okay,
that's
now,
an example of union busting.
You might argue that it would make more sense for a company to deal with a union because it would deal in the collective and not have to go and deal with everybody else individually. But I suppose maybe history has shown that at times that unions have used their power to organise strikes or to take more money from companies than perhaps they could afford. And that's why many companies do not want to deal with unions.
Well, firstly, there are many companies that do deal with unions. Indeed, the public sector, the government does, and then many private sector unions, including a lot of multinationals, recognise and engage in collective bargaining. So certainly there's no credible threat to FDI in Ireland for recognition, for mandatory recognition. When you talk about kind of profits and pay, recognising a trade union and collectively bargaining with workers is basically saying to workers they're allowed to have a voice. It doesn't mandate anything other than that you will recognise and you will talk and you will negotiate. Workers are pretty reasonable and sensible, and they negotiate both decent pay increases, but also the job security of their jobs in the future. And that's what workers will balance when they engage in collectively bargaining. So I agree with you, actually. I think it can be a very good thing for employers to negotiate collectively and to recognise their right.
Or maybe they want the flexibility, is it, to be able to do individual deals with individual workers depending on their performance?
Flexibility is always also negotiated with unions. So we talk about remote working, we talk about flexibility for employees and flexibility for employers. And there's many good examples of collective agreements that provide for that flexibility. But the defining thing is they're actually willing to sit down with their workers who collectively organise to say, do you know what, we're going to agree procedures around this. We're going to agree a process around this. It isn't going to be a free-for-all for every individual. We're going to have some rules, and that's regulated by both workers and their employer.
So tell us a little bit about this study. There's 4 unions involved in it, is there?
Yeah, so 4 private sector unions make up the Respect at Work campaign, and that's the Communication Workers Union, the Financial Services Union, Mandate, which is the Retail Workers Union, you'll know, and SIPTU, which is the General Workers Union. Collectively, they would represent in and around 250,000 private sector workers across virtually all sectors within the labour market and the economy. And we surveyed a number of union representatives, and shockingly what they reported back to us was essentially that they do face hostility, and they face what we call union busting tactics from their employer when they're trying to organise their union at work. And the number one example of that we found was the individual victimisation of the union representative or the shop steward. So them being individually punished or penalised for their trade union activity.
For acting on behalf of others.
On behalf of others, trying to represent.
What sort of punishment?
So it ranges up to and including the worst form, which is dismissal, but thankfully that is the less frequent. More frequent things would be such as your rosters changing, your hours of work being changed at short notice, being isolated but from workers, so being put in a room or being taken off a shift where you might engage with colleagues and being isolated, or maybe getting a poor performance rating, which then impacts on your pay. So there's a lot of different examples.
You mentioned FDI earlier, and I don't think I brought FDI up, but there is a listener who wants to know, is there more union reluctance amongst the workforces in the American multinationals?
Not necessarily. Many multinationals do recognise and engage. American multinationals, Japanese multinationals recognise and engage with our unions. But yes, obviously, as our economy has shifted probably more and more towards large-scale multinationals, there certainly is a challenge there. But I would say that many of the multinationals that came into our country in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they all recognise and engage with employers. They still do today. And they're fine working away. They've got good profits, good wages.
Another one says, I'm in construction and you have to be in a union. I don't want to be and we have to pay for it. Ridiculous. So could it be, as well as union busting, there are employees who are forced by the type of work they're in to be part of a union even if they don't want to be?
Well, there isn't too many closed shop agreements left today, Matt, and we're not actually looking for conscripts. We believe there is lots of people voluntarily who want to be in a union and they deserve to be protected in that. There is research from UCD, from Professor John Geary a number of months ago, that says depending on the age demographic, 50 to 67% of all workers want a union. We have Ireland Think's polling data from last year that says 74% of all workers want collective bargaining. Yet here we are in the economy within the region at 25% union density or 30% collective bargaining coverage. So there's what we call a representation gap between what workers want, which is 60 to 70% want their unions, and then in reality, only 20 to 30% enjoy collective bargaining. And I believe that gap can be explained by employer hostility and union busting.
Thank you very much for being with us, Gareth Murphy from the Financial Services Union.